So we're working our way through the book of Exodus, and this morning I want to talk to you about the Jewish feasts or Jewish holidays. And so I'm going to read a passage to you from Exodus chapter 23. If you want to turn there, you may, or you can just listen. Exodus chapter 23. And I gave you a handout that I'm going to refer to in just a minute. I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And hopefully everybody got one. If you didn't, raise your hand and I'll have one personally delivered to you. Would you like Word Forest go? Can you grab the rest of those back there? And
We'll share one. We're good.
Are you good? He's going to get some anyway. So wait just a second. So I think there's plenty, so everyone can have their own if they would like. You can read. So Lorraine wanted one, and anybody else not get one? Okay. All right, so let me read this passage to you from Exodus chapter 23, starting with verse 10. For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the 7th year let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyards and your olive grove. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that your slaves born in your household, your servants, and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not involve the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv. For in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your fields. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year when you gather in your crops from the fields. 3 times a year all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offering must not be kept until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. And I'll just pause right there. So there were 8 festivals that the Jewish people celebrated and still celebrate today. Actually, there's one more they celebrate today as well. But actually they're in 2 different categories, and both these categories are based on the number 7. And we haven't talked a lot about numerology, but people have done studies and have found significance in particular numbers throughout Scripture. And 7 is one number that seems to come up again and again. It's the 7 days of creation, and seems to be a sign of completion, of the end of something. And so the first festival is the Sabbath day, and that happens every 7 days. So there's that 7-day cycle. So 1 out of 7 is the Sabbath. And then the other 7 feasts happen once a year. And so that's also, every year there are 7 different feasts that you celebrate every year. And so I'm just going to talk about some of them. I found this article online. It seemed like it would be helpful because as you're trying to read through this, it just kind of all becomes pretty confusing. And Leviticus kind of repeats a lot of what Exodus is saying, and so you get confused as this, that, and that, this. And so this seemed to be somewhat helpful. The word Tanakh actually refers to the Jewish scriptures, and it actually comes from 3 Hebrew words. Ta is the word for Torah, got blank there for a minute, Torah, and the Torah are the writings, the Mosaic writings, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then the second letter refers to the prophets, I'm getting this right order, I think, and then the third is the other writings. And so that's how the Jewish Bible is organized into those 3 sections, which we say, well, I wonder if that reflects the Trinity. Anyway. So, but that's what the word Tanakh means. And there are 8 festivals, as I said, on here. There's one other celebration that modern-day Jews celebrate, and that's Hanukkah, and that happens around the time of Christmas. Some people believe that that's prophesied in the book of Daniel, but Hanukkah comes as a celebration of the rededication of the temple in 160-something 8 BC, Herod's temple, when they rededicated it. So that's sort of that celebration, but that's not a celebration that is in this list of feasts to celebrate. So I want to talk about some of the feasts, as I said, and I want to talk about why they are important to us. I believe they all do. I just don't simply have time, at least this morning, to go through all of them, so I'm just going to go through a couple. And the first one I want to talk about is Sabbath. Because I think that we live in a time, and I've preached sermons to you before about Sabbath, but I just want to remind you, I think it's especially important as we sort of move more into summer, as we move into a time when more people take vacations, to see the importance of Sabbath, of inserting rest into your life, and to seeing rest not as an inconvenience, but as something which is really crucial for your well-being. And that you need to have not only a day a week where you rest, where you sort of disassociate yourself, where you disconnect from the stress of this life, but there also needs to be Sabbath times throughout the year where you set aside longer periods of time to where you allow your soul to rest. My friend Steve Murray, who preaches at Real Life, is walking the El Camino right now. And part of it, not the whole thing, but part of it, which is, if you're not familiar, it's a spiritual journey through mostly through Spain, and it's been in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years that pilgrims have walked this path just to find God. And so he just chose to do that all by himself for 20 days. But he's sending little posts occasionally, and so I'm kind of walking it with him. It's been really enjoyable. But we need those times where we set aside Sabbath. And I know that there are some times when it is just impossible for us to have a Sabbath day. Sometimes work requires you. There are deadlines that just simply have to be met, and you simply do it. Or maybe there are people that you need to help, or appointments that you have, or obligations you have. You simply cannot get away from having, or to give yourself a Sabbath rest. But let me just say emphatically, do never deny yourself a Sabbath for money. Some employers will pay extra money for you to work on Sunday. Don't ever be tempted to work on Sunday for money. I can understand that you need to do it sometimes because of obligations, or because of commitments, because of time members, but don't do it because you think you need to catch up, because you need the extra money. Your soul is more important than anything money can provide for you. And God has very explicitly said that's why we sleep at night. And that's why we need to have rest in our lives. So don't neglect your soul, don't neglect your spiritual relationship to God, and don't neglect the people that you love by putting other things as more important than that. So that's why Sabbath was extremely important in God's. The next thing I want to talk about is Passover. And actually the next 3 feasts, and on the very back, let me just mention this too, there's a chart on the last page. And I apologize, it's kind of fuzzy. It's not because your glasses aren't working. It's just fuzzy, and mine's so fuzzy that it's not even here. But that seemed to sort of be helpful to see what time of year these festivals were celebrated, and when in the calendar year. The Jewish calendar year is based upon the moon, the cycles of the moon. So there's 9 cycles of the moon in a year, and so each of the cycles of the moon sort of tells you when the feasts will be, and that's why Easter is different every year, because it's on the first day of the week after this particular moon cycle. And so it's on a Sunday, and it's always at the specific time of the year. And then the equivalent of that's Passover. And then the equivalent, or the 2 feasts that go along with Passover is unleavened bread and first fruits. And those 3 feasts all occur in the Easter celebration. Passover is the night before, when he celebrated with his disciples. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then unleavened bread is the next day, the day of trial, the day of physical pain and suffering. And then the third one, first fruits, is the celebration of the resurrection. It's the harvest. It's the newness. It's the beginning of everything. It's the hope. It's when the farmers planted their grain, and it was their hope. I mean, this was their sustenance. This was their life for the coming year, was invested in that. So let me ask you a question as I talk about Passover. When you get together and you're doing a family picture, and they're all lined up there, and you're holding the camera, what do you say? And why do you say cheese? Yeah. I was looking at some pictures from the turn of the century, 1900s, and nobody was smiling. Ever think about that? I think in some ways, in our culture today, we worship happiness. And we neglect sorrow and pain, and we somehow see those as unimportant, and that we need to get them out of our life. That's why we don't ever want to see pictures of people that are not smiling, because smiling is the most important thing. If you're not happy, then there's something wrong with you. Now, I'm not suggesting that sometimes people are clinically depressed, and they certainly need to get out of that. But I think it's really healthy for us, and I think Passover teaches us that it's healthy to experience and to recognize that there's sadness in our life as well. Passover remembers that Egypt wasn't a fun place. Passover was pain. Passover was suffering. Passover was where you had no choices in your life. Passover was remembering that it was out of this that God drew you. Thinking about our fathers. Some of you, for some people, Father's Day is not a happy day because their fathers were not nice people. Some people were raised under horrific conditions. And so Father's Day for them, it doesn't bring up joy, it brings up sadness. But it is valuable to you, and you need to recognize that that is an emotion God gave you, and there's great benefit from experiencing sadness in your life as well. I was talking to Steve about there's this modern trend to take sadness out of funerals. Have you ever heard somebody say, well, when I die, I want it to be a joyous celebration. I don't want there to be any sadness at all. And I think that's indicative of how we feel in North America. We don't want to experience, we don't want to think about sadness. But the truth is that death is sadness. And I think it is horribly wrong for us to have a memorial and not to feel sad. Yes, it's certainly fine to end the service with saying, this has been sad, but there is a joyous aspect to this. There is joy, but the reality is death is hard. Death is painful. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with feeling sad. I can't tell you how many, in fact, it happened this weekend. One of the cousins was sharing something sad in his life, horrible in his sad, and he started weeping. And he apologized. Do you do that? When you cry, do you apologize? Say, oh, I'm sorry. And we do that because we've been taught sadness isn't nice. It's a bad thing. And Passover reminds us sadness is part of our life. But sadness also reminds us that Passover reminds us that there's another feast. There's a feast of suffering, and sometimes sadness is coupled with sadness. In fact, it's often coupled with suffering. But then comes resurrection. New seeds are planted in the midst of that. New seeds of hope. And so that sadness reminds us, and we go there, but we don't need to dwell there because the feast of first fruits. So I think probably the most important thing I can say to you this morning, aside from don't neglect your Sabbath, is to don't neglect your sadness. And don't fall prey to the idea. In North America, we sell more antidepressants than any other country in the world because we have this phobia about being sad. We think that every moment of our life needs to be filled with joy and happiness, and that we don't want to deal with any sadness. But it is in great sadness that we really figure out some things about ourselves. It is in great sadness that we really discover who we are and what we're about and what's important in life and who are important in life. And it's sometimes in great sadness that we see things about people that we didn't see before. I was thinking this morning about a story about my father. My father was a pastor, and bivocationally he was a principal and a pastor. And he was amazingly revered. I still have people today come up to me and say, "Oh, your dad was the most amazing spiritual man." But you know, the truth is that he was not a good father, and he was a very, very, I don't want to use the word horrible, but inadequate husband. One time he and I were up in the San Juan Islands, and we had a little cabin up there, and the neighbor man came over that we knew Ed, and he came over to visit with us. And he came into the cabin, it was dark, and we were just standing around, and you could see that he was just in turmoil. And he had come there because he and his wife were in the midst of horrible, horrible times. Their marriage was dissolving. And he knew, he respected, he had great regard for my father. And so he came to my father. My father had no clue as to what to say to him. And I can remember to this day standing there with my father, and I was expecting this wisdom to come out, that always came out. And there was nothing there because this was an area of my father's life that he had no clue. He had no idea how to be a husband because it wasn't mentored to him from his father. He had no relationship with his father. But I also now see in great sadness the loss of my father, that he didn't have a father to teach him how to be a father. And whereas earlier in my life I might have been bitter about some of the things my dad did, now I can see in that sadness the loss that he experienced not having that with his own father. The other feast that I want to just mention, and I actually talked about it last week, is Pentecost. And Pentecost happens so many days. How many days is it after? 50 days? Yeah, 50 days after first fruits. So we celebrated that just a week ago. And Pentecost is the day when it was part of it. There was a harvest, the first harvest. It was also the getting ready for the second harvest. And so there's more information there about it. But for us, it is Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1 is all around Pentecost. And so the brand new followers of Christ, the brand new church, the brand new ecclesia, which was called out ones, were in sadness. They were moving through the seasons of Passover and the seasons of unleavened bread and even first fruits, but they had no clue as to what was next. And then Pentecost came. And with Pentecost came the Spirit of God. And with Pentecost came energy to move forward from the sadness, from the pain. With Pentecost came new vision, new direction, new hope. And I want to encourage you, and we talk about the importance of the Holy Spirit, but I want to encourage you during this time, this season, this June, July, and August season, to make sure that you celebrate a Pentecost with God and the Spirit of God. And have that relationship become fresh to you again. Make sure that happens. The last thing I want to say to you is, in general, why in the world did God have these feasts? What is the point of them all? And you need to remember that these people had been living for hundreds of years with regiment, with oppression, with everyone telling them exactly what to do. And when you move from that, you need to move into a system where there's some order. When you need to move from the chaos of slavery, you need to move to a place of order. And one of the things that you need to constantly be reminded of is that celebrating is really important. Because when you get underneath the tyranny of life and all that happens, it's really easy to say, you know what, I'm just too tired to do this. Something new, something fresh, and I think, and especially as we get older, honestly, I'm getting older, probably you are too. It's so much easier when something comes to just say, you know what, I'm just going to stay home today, sleep in. And God says, yes, that's the temptation, but you need to celebrate because you are part of a people This isn't a journey you're making by yourself. This is a journey you're making with people. And we need to be more regimented about inviting each other over for barbecues, inviting each other to go out and have coffee, to spend time together, even in those moments where we feel like, I'm just so tired, I can't do it. But we need to say, you know what? This is good for them. It's good for me. It's good for my soul. I need to celebrate. I need to enjoy life. And I need to require myself to do that because sometimes I don't feel like I simply have the energy to do it. So put feasts into your life. Just tell you one story in Indiana. I was sharing this story actually this morning. One of our trips to France, I forget which one it was, but we were sitting in the home of an elderly couple from the church, and they served us dinner. And dinner in France is an occasion. When I was growing up, you ate dinner like this, as fast as you could. And that, because it was just something to do to feed yourself. But in France, dinner is an occasion. Every evening you sit down, and we spent several hours getting through this meal. She'd bring something out, and another bottle of wine would come out, and we would talk for 20 minutes. And then something else. She would disappear in the kitchen, and something else would come out. And I just remember sitting there thinking, wow, this is taking so long. This is going to take all night. And, afterwards I thought, that was one of the most beautiful evenings I've ever spent. Because we celebrated, we feasted together. And we talked. And we enjoyed each other. So, in this world that we live in that is so hectic and so filled with pressures, remember to give yourself Sabbath. Remember to force yourself to have lots of feasts of joy and happiness with those people that you love. And don't push out every moment of sadness. And please don't apologize for your tears. Stand up and let me give you a blessing. May the Creator God inspire you today to be more in love with each other, to be more in love with the Creator, to be more in love with life. Amen.